This is Yesterzine, the literal magazine show. Every episode we take a magazine from the Golden Age, pass judgment over their best and worst rated titles, and see if the issue has anything to teach us about gaming, when backwards compatibility meant a giant adapter sat on top of your Mega Drive. But it's not the Mega Drive we want to talk about this week, it's the old nemesis the SNES that's in focus, as a copy of Superplay issue 13 drops open on the virtual table. The gaming heaven is the biggest movie license of quite possibly the first half of the decade, and another instance of Sega and Nintendo getting entirely different games. The gaming hell would have been the biggest license of this decade, but in 1993, no one cared. Finally, our feature involves two classic racers from other systems storming onto the SNES under new identities. But who wore it better? First though, we've got the opening of a new theme park to go to. It doesn't really matter if you watch this show because you were there at the time, or you watch this show to find out what it was like back then. You'll know Jurassic Park, if only for the more recent semi-reboot film series. It's possible you don't know it was originally a novel written by the late creator of ER, Michael Crichton. The novel came out in 1990, but by then 4 studios were already fighting it out to make the film. By today's standards, it's kind of surprising that the final price of those rights was still only $1.5 million. They went to Steven Spielberg, Universal Studios, and crucially, the Star Wars SFX team Industrial Light and Magic. The result was fairly legendary. A classic monster movie and a story of hubris gone wrong tied to special effects that have aged fantastically well for now being the best part of 30 years old. A total investment of around $100 million in film and marketing, eventually winning Universal and Spielberg's company Amblin over $900 million in cinema revenue alone, eventually smashing the billion barrier with its 20th anniversary 3D re-release. There was of course a tie-in game. In fact, there are an astonishing 7 entirely different games based on the movie in the year after it released. Exactly like Aladdin, the SNES, Mega Drive and Master System all got 3 entirely different concepts. But there's also a completely distinct NES entry, an arcade shooter game, a mini-game collection based 3DO outing, and most inexplicably, a point-and-click adventure on the Mega CD whose plot is set entirely after the movie finishes. If this channel is still here for the 30th anniversary, maybe we'll go through them all. But our focus today is of course the SNES game, which is also what you'll have played on Amiga or PC. It's the most technically accomplished of the septet, and it was also one of the best received, as you've probably realised by it being today's heaven. The plot of this one broadly treads the movie, as you find yourself on the island with the dinosaurs treating the fences in their original habitat as more of a suggestion than any kind of rule. The game was actually by Ocean of America. You forget how big Ocean was once upon a time, and this was about their peak. The fact a publisher most of us associate with movie licenses on the Sinclair spectrum and this stupidly extensive budget range hit squad even had a US division is almost surprising. But for a couple of years around this time, they were one of the biggest publishers in the world. 3 years after this, they merged with Infogram, and there started a long, slow descent into, well, not quite oblivion. But we'll actually talk about that next episode, so let's start playing the game without in any way reading the manual, as per. And we're doing okay. We're ambling around what is clearly a quite expansive game world, defending ourselves from dinosaurs. The game doesn't have levels as such, it's up to you to figure out what you have to do, and visiting buildings, which, for want of a better comparison, actually makes this almost like a Zelda game in structure, with the buildings acting as the dungeons do in that series to a degree. I kinda know none of this as we play now, of course, but still, I'm having a great time running around, easily killing the crapping hell it's your mum! Alright, let's go for a slightly more careful explore, and discover it's sometimes quite difficult to see exactly where you can go and what's impassable, especially around hills like I'm navigating now. There's also the advice from your co-workers, which is welcome but doesn't pause the game and really obstructs your view of the mega lizards trying to eat you. I don't have a hardware copy of this, so maybe it's an emulator glitch, as when I eventually read the manual it implied it should be a lot more see-through than what we're currently experiencing. We also discover this move. What's he doing here? Exercises? Is this what the game thinks crouching is? Has he just seen a particularly attractive dinosaur from one of his preferred genders? Okay, enough of this mess. Manual. Firstly, that crouch move is pick up item. Excellent. Secondly, this really is like a mini Zelda, or perhaps to a degree an easier to understand Fallout. In this open world, most of which you can immediately visit and explore, you ultimately have 6 main missions to accomplish. Firstly, to find and restore the main power to sort out the motion sensors, then secure the visitor centre, and then a series of missions involving clearing out raptors and summoning some sort of help. There's a really decent selection of weapons too. You get this nice recharging cattle prod to start, and it'll always be there, and, with a cooldown, never run out of ammo. I appreciate that in a game like this, as too many leave you helpless and stranded forever just for wanting to kill things in a survival game. The new weapons range from a shotgun to a gas grenade launcher, entirely essential if you want to take out your mum. In the game at least. In real life it's obviously a much easier process. There's also the usual points, health and objective pickups, most notably the security and ID cards, all of which tie into the plot of both the game and movie, allowing you into places those characters could go, such as the buildings. It's the buildings that provide the biggest surprise. The game drops the 2D isometric perspective and goes full FPS. For a SNES, this is impressive. The Doom port to the SNES needed the Super FX chip after all. Your journeys through the buildings, in this case the visitor centre, represent the dungeons of the game. There's a nice sense of it being the same world, as almost everything carries straight through to the change of perspective, including your health and the weapons you're carrying. The controls are understandably awkward on a pad, and most of that, to be fair, is the fault of the pad and frame rate. Although it's weird they chose to make the shoulder buttons a second method of rotating rather than include any kind of strafe. It does mean you basically have to drive Dr. Grant like a tank, much like that dinosaur he was trying to attract earlier. There was another option. If you'd managed to convince your parents that a SNES and Mario Paint was an important educational tool, this game actually does support the SNES mouse in these sections. That's not going to help me running this on a Raspberry Pi though, so I haven't tried it. At least in this early building, they're not too difficult though. Only a few of the dinosaurs have any kind of projectile weaponry, so you've got the advantage of range on them. Plus they don't all attack you on sight, so you can play it smooth and careful and get the drop on a lot of them if you're smart. The controls don't suit playing this at Doom speed, and that's fine, because if you did that, you're going to get turbo murdered. These sections are tense too. You find yourself edging through doors and attempting to peer around corners, neither of which are easy things to do with the controls. If you don't though, it is very easy to become the one that gets surprised. Reach the top of the building, once you figure out how lifts work, and you can even get out onto the roof, where again the game switches to top down without missing a beat. There's a lot to see here, and on my journey through the centre I didn't even figure out how to turn on the motion sensors. Probably because I hadn't figured out how to turn on the power yet. It's an expansive game this. It split opinion a bit on release. Superplay were obviously fans, along with the likes of Games Master and SNES Force, but it got increasingly worse receptions from Total, EGM, and a mere 6 out of 10 from Edge. Although given that's the score they gave Grand Theft Auto 3, let's not read too much into that. Edge criticised it for a lack of excitement, marking a fairly low level of self-awareness for that particular magazine. But their point was, in-game you didn't have a lot of help figuring out what you should be doing, and so could spend a lot of time wandering aimlessly. I see their point, but disagree. The manual has a map, and it tells you exactly what you're supposed to do in order on the quest page. That's as much or more help than the likes of Zelda would give you, which is partly why I bring them up. It's perhaps a more grown-up game than people were expecting for the license, and I can't see that as a bad thing. There is more though. The game for some reason has a lives system. With the 2 continues, you'll have a total of only 12 lives to reach the finish of the game, and that speaks of a slight confusion as to whether this is supposed to be an arcade game or an adventure. It pushes itself much further towards the latter, and in that respect it's a little harsh. It's even more so as Jurassic Park has no save system of any kind. Back in 1993, you're completing this in one playthrough, or you're not completing this. Superplay give themselves away as reviewing an unfinished game here. Clearly, this was a slightly baffling decision made very late on in development, because when Jonathan Davis wrote his review, he specifically called it out for having infinite continues. Something we've just seen is not true of the finished game. This caused him to suggest the game might be too easy, which is quite funny as IGN's look back on the newly restricted lives version in 2014 pegged it as one of the most difficult games of all time. For us emulator players in 2020, we do of course solve that problem. We've got save states, and if that's how you're going to play it, I urge you to do so. It's an accessible and brilliant use of a license that borrows from some of the best games ever made. If you're playing on real hardware without the assistance of an action replay cart, go in with that knowledge in mind, but do consider going in. There are better movie license games, but very, very few that do such a good job of putting you in the world of the movie. They might have had to write 7 Jurassic Park games to get a really good one, but a really good one they got. So let me take you back to the Amiga for a second. Because in the beginning there was Crazy Cars, and then there was another one of it. They weren't great. Part of the big run of generic arcade-like racers of the late 80s, and this might not surprise some given they were produced by Titus, who've come in for a kicking on this show before. Not least, of course, for Superman 64. But we also saw them to be a party to a crime of the highest order in the season finale of the 73% trials, in the form of Prehistoric. It's fair to say they have a reputation. It's also fair to say it was often deserved. Their best received game was probably Titus the Fox, a platform game weirdly originally featuring a French comedian, before being retooled for everyone else based on the nearest character immediately to hand, their own mascot. There is one more, fondly remembered by some of us but now largely forgotten, partly because of its iffy predecessors, and partly because a year after its release it was slightly retooled and renamed. Crazy Cars 3. An innovative Lotus-style racer where you could bet on the races, turning it into almost an unofficial tie-in game to Cannonball Run, and where crucially they'd nailed the speed and handling issues that had plagued the other two. Amiga Power, in impressively prescient fashion, had mused they'd have been better off releasing it under a completely different name. Because of course they did. By the time it hit the SNES a year later, it had been renamed Lamborghini American Challenge, and had picked up the 2-player mode sorely missing from the original Amiga version. It becomes the first game in our 2-game racing comparison. The other is a game called Top Gear 2, and our reviewer, Amiga Power gentleman editor Jonathan Davies, does not mention it, but it also has Amiga lineage. If you didn't know, let me see if you get it if I play you the title theme from the first Top Gear. If you're an Amiga gaming god, that's going to be familiar. Listen to this. Yes, the ending theme from Lotus 2 is remixed into the title theme for the first Top Gear. And actually, most of the Top Gear music is Lotus remixes, because the first 2 Top Gear games are both warmed over ports of the Lotus engine shorn of its license. Which suddenly makes this interesting. Because Lotus was the definitive Amiga racing series. We can debate for hours which one is the best and why you are wrong for thinking it was the second one, but we can all at least agree that at least one of them is right up there with the best arcade way to drive a car on the machine. And while someone will be along in a minute to mention Jaguar XJ220, for my money at the time, Crazy Cars 3 was the only game to ever touch them. So on SNES, both altered from their Amiga releases and given a new coat of paint in the case of Crazy Cars, and paint, new carpets and a plug-in Fresh Pine air freshener in the case of Top Gear, which one has come out best? Top Gear 2 swipes its major game progression from the first Lotus game, with a series of championships each set in a single country, starting with Australia. It also swipes its general aesthetic from Lotus. If you didn't know its lineage, then you'd have every chance of guessing. The 20-car races are not dissimilar to the first Lotus as well. Progression, though, is not gated by your championship results. As long as you finish in the top 10 in any given race, you keep going. The manual doesn't tell you this, but merely claims if you place in the top 10 you'll get championship points, before listing the number of points you get for 1st to 6th. You only win money for a top 6 finish as well. I found this out because, having finished easily in the top 6 in my test race, my skills of course immediately went absolutely to crap as soon as I turned the capture on, leading to a complete and miserable failure. A second attempt at least netted me 8th for progression, but no cash. As always with career modes, I like this though. I really don't like a career mode where you have to win every race to progress. Here, with the short 4-race championships and opponents who credibly do not always finish every race in the same order, it is possible to make up for a bad race. And indeed, despite that non-score, non-cash race, I did end up winning the championship. Wait, money, you ask? Well, that's the first difference from the Lotus games, because this game has a basic but effective upgrade system for your car, with engines, gearboxes, tyres and armour to be purchased. Each has 4 levels, and given there's no trade-ins, you have to try and avoid buying the lower end items unless you absolutely have to. Which brings me to the other difference, and the other upgrade item, Nitro. For each race you get 6 shots of car Red Bull to use as you choose, and you might want to mentally keep track of what you've got, because the gauge, even in this emulator version, is really tricky to read at speed. It must have been next to impossible to see on an imperfect CRT connection at the time. Already in this Australian Championship, it's technically rather lovely for a 16-bit racer. The music is great, although really sounds more like ported Amiga tunes than anything the SNES would natively normally do. The graphics are nice though, with an excellent looking night level, and a wet race for which you'll need new tyres to be effective. Splashing out on those netted me my first win. We move on, and the second championship is in Britain, starting off in Scotland at, apparently, Loch Ness, where it's foggy. Of course it is. Again though, it looks good, with the lights being the only part of the other cars visible in the distance. I'm getting the hang of this a little more by this point as well, not least because I've figured out the boost system demands a strategy almost entirely opposite from most boost-based races. You see, in general, exemplified as much as anything by this, the recent release Hotshot Racers, you want to save your boost, and then spam it to crap at the end of the race. This is because arcade racers normally use a rubber banding system where it's like you're connected to the AI by one. If you're behind, it'll slow them down. If you're ahead, then they perform superhuman speed feats to catch you. So there's no point using boost early on, because they'll just catch you as soon as you stop. Top Gear's different. There doesn't appear to be any rubber banding at all, and in fact it's very important to get through the pack early. You start at the back where it's very crowded, and it's very easy to blow any chance of a good result by just bouncing off cars running around 15th place for long enough that first place has buggered off down the road. So while you want to spread your boost out, it's absolutely a viable tactic to use more of it in the early laps to make sure you can at least get through to the points before they storm out of reach. It's damn fun though. By using fewer but more powerful boosts than most games, then there's a genuine strategy to where to deploy them, both in terms of the race conditions and the track layout, especially when you need to find multiple points in a lap to deploy, or smack it off a wall and have to panic boost to make up for it. I loved this. It's the hidden sequel to the original Lotus, by being much more of a straight sequel to its own previous entry than Lotus 2 ever was, right down to its major feature being races are no longer split screen in single player. Later races even force you to think about fuel just like you had to in Lotus 1, and even damage. I have a huge capture file to this, because I kept playing it for far too long, right through the British Championship's visit to Stonehenge, it's a quality henge, and ultimately winning that one too. I literally only stopped playing it because it was dinner time, and I've not said that about a retro game in a while. It's a shame it didn't get a handheld release, because it'd be perfect for it. Except it will be. If you own the fine new retro cartridge handheld, the Evercade, Top Gear, now for legal reasons going by its Japanese name Top Racer, is owned by Pico Interactive, and the original is already out on the first Pico Interactive collection. This game is coming early next year as part of their second release. That is going to be goddarned essential. Superplay gave it a slightly stingy 74%, and really the only excuse they gave for that is it looks a little old, which I can't entirely disagree with. But I think they're saying that mostly because of their obsession with Mode 7 graphics, even when those aren't the right way to go about things. The other point they give is that it's mostly accelerating and going left and right, which is pretty much what an arcade racer is. But fair enough. We've defined a perfectly sensible baseline here. A really good low-to-style racing game was worth 74% on the SNES in 1993. Superplay thought this head-to-head was really close. I'll skip ahead and tell you Lamborghini American Challenge is going to get the dreaded 73%. If you haven't seen the 73% trials, 73% was famously the marker magazine gave when they didn't want to recommend a game, but also not piss off the publisher. This was revealed by Amiga Power in a feature exactly 3 issues after the departure of one Jonathan Davies as editor. It's a good thing no one's on trial here, isn't it? Lamborghini is on the face of it pretty similar. It also has a series of races across several divisions, but here there's more of them per division and it's gated with an entry fee to the races rather than previous finishes. Fair enough, let's do a racing. The first thing I notice is there's something fairly weird about that car movement. Maybe it's the way it drifts across the screen in the opposite direction to where you press, but it's actually really disconcerting coming straight from Top Gear. It also has the effect of effectively narrowing the road, at least from your own perception. We can get used to it though, especially once we discover we also have boost, or really, boost. It goes on forever, which is only fair since I've only got the one. It's enough to propel me to an almost suspiciously easy race win. We take on a second race, and clearly we've bitten off more than we can chew with this higher grade one, and labour to a position outside of the points. This is exacerbated by the fact we apparently don't get a boost every race, it's something we're going to need to go to the upgrade shop and buy. In traditional Yesterzine fashion, I immediately forget this and enter a third, easier race, choosing to spend all my remaining money on a ruinous bet with my contemporaries. I'm all in. And it works. We win, collecting a nice little nest egg to help recover from the previous failure. And then it's game over. Wait, what? The game gives absolutely no reason for this, but to be fair, the game also doesn't even really tell you it's game over until the reappearance of the title screen acts as a relatively strong hint to this fact. The manual also fails to tell you what a game over condition might be, merely offering that divisional progress is gated behind a playoff race. But that's not what I just did. Incidentally, the manual for the CD32 version also says there's no saving system, but that's okay because you can complete the game in a single session. Way to make people feel good about spending 40 quid, Titus. Eventually I work out it's probably because I don't have the money to enter any of the remaining races, which proves to be the correct answer. I further wonder how far this goes. So we visit the upgrade shop and buy an upgrade that costs all of our money. As soon as we return to the map, yep, the game does not warn you. The game lets you do it. Buying an upgrade is a failure condition in Lamborghini American Challenge. That's quite impressively shit. I bet actual money QA spotted this and a product manager ignored them. On the plus side, if you've been smart enough to video capture all your gameplay and can thus see the password, the game does have a save system. We take the chance to check out how much those boosts are, and the answer is apparently $50,000. What are they made of? Nitrous oxide or something? Oh wait, yes. To give you some context, I'm not sure I won 50 large in the entire time I played this game for this segment, so you basically don't get boost. The races are longer than Top Gear, but they're also more dull. You see considerably fewer real enemy cars, and even the appearance of a lot of public road drone cars doesn't help. Because they're a lot slower than you, much time is spent just dodging them, which makes actually racing the other race cars a lot harder, especially as they don't appear to have any problem avoiding traffic. It also means that it's very easy to get trapped behind really quite a lot of the other racers at the beginning of the race, between the cloud of competitors and the drone traffic. And it's especially a problem given that lack of boost and the fact you need to finish very high up. If you don't get past them quickly, as I didn't in this race, you're going to spend the entire rest of the race pretty much chasing one dude. Your chances are already over. And that's fine, in racing you have off days. But here you don't generally make a profit on the entrance fee unless you finish in the top 2, and obviously most of the time to win a bet against the other named competitors you're going to have to actually win the race. Keeping your money up in this game is hard. If you turn betting off, which commendably you are allowed to do, I don't know how you get anywhere with it without an 100% record. It's probably time to explain that career mode rant about games that expect you to win every race in reality. Lamborghini Crazy Challenge, much like Top Lotus, has 20 car races. But it doesn't, does it? You're only racing one car, and that's the bastard who starts first. There are traffic cars and rival cars, but really they're just all drone cars of various speeds. So why bother putting them in? Just make it a head-to-head with drone cars. There is no material difference in Lamborghini between a 4th and 20th place finish. So if you're still 6th with 20% of the race to go, just back off and at least avoid the damage. Which for an arcade racing game is not what they should be pushing. I had fond memories of both these games in their original versions, but it's pretty clear coming back to them in console form, there really is only one winner. Everything in Lambo is just worse than the equivalent thing in Top Gear, to the extent I want to rename Lambo to Top Gear, but after they hired those two renter-presenter dicks to host it. Despite everything, it's not bad. It's competent. But at times it almost feels like an in-development version of Top Gear. Like some recently rediscovered beta before they fixed the driving, thought better of the betting, and retooled the boost and progression systems for release. Both these games returned to Amiga, which in the case of Top Gear 2 is actually helpful. As I said, at times it feels a better sequel to Lotus than Lotus 2 was, fitting much closer to how the original Lotus worked than they did. It's the hidden 4th Lotus game, and it does something appreciably different. Why they bothered with Lambo, I don't know. It was Crazy Cars 3 plus a 2-player mode that struggled on an A500. Amiga Power basically gave it a non-review on that basis, which is hardly surprising given Crazy 3 was 2 years old by this point. In any case, today, Top Gear is worth a decent wodge more than 74%, and Lambo considerably less than its 73%, and I think Jonathan knew that. Superplay gave 4 additional scores for the fairly traditional categories of graphics, sound, gameplay and game life. In all those, the gap between the two was considerably more than 1%. The closest Lambo got was for game life at 5% gap. So why the high score? To me it seems he just wanted to indicate Top Gear was better and leave it at that. After all, you'll buy the better game regardless of the gap. Even the review says about Lamborghini, it's possible to carry on, but it's a struggle, and somehow just doesn't seem worth it, especially when you could be playing Top Gear 2 instead. Like I say, it's a good thing no one's on trial here, isn't it? It's hard to conceive now, but there was a time when the Avengers were just some comics. Not exactly obscure, of course, but not exactly mega mainstream consciousness. But then, a decade or so back, the Marvel Cinematic Universe appeared, proceeding, and I checked this, to release 4 movies every week for 10 years, becoming the biggest name in entertainment since Florian Cloud Debunuviali O'Malley Armstrong. So there wasn't actually huge excitement at the appearance of this licensed game in 1993, a conversion from a Data East arcade machine I've never heard anyone mention before. Judging by the review score of this game, below several other viable candidates, there's probably a reason for that. The intro is actually kinda adorable. Despite Captain America having top billing, this game actually includes 4 of the Avengers, and the game painstakingly introduces Captain America, Iron Man, Vision and Hawkeye with pages of text explaining special abilities I'm sure will be well used in the game, as well as the main villain, Red Dude. Okay, so I'm not great on the Avengers either, but at least I know Vision Man's real name, Android. It really doesn't matter which character you go for, of course. They all have the same 2 attacks, a weak punch and a vaguely themed projectile weapon that does exactly the same damage with the exact same range as the other 3 vaguely themed projectile weapons. They also all have the same jump, even Iron Man, who famously otherwise has a suit which allows him to fly. Here, apparently it's malfunctioning. World's greatest engineer my arse. They also appear to have exactly the same hit points. Yeah, Hawkeye, who is canonically just a normal bloke, is apparently scientifically exactly as hard as a man in an iron suit and a literal robot. I think it's pretty clear what we have here is a game that could have fitted any license or just been a generic punch 'em up, which someone saw an opportunity to fit into what might well have been a cheap license. Which is fine. Let's ignore the license entirely and see if this is a decent generic beat 'em up. What do you think? Well, firstly, there's the issue common with badly programmed games of this type. The getting lined up vertically is a dick. Enemies are essentially 2D, and if you're on the wrong level, then your kiddie punch is going to miss them, and so is your projectile. And given the different physical heights of enemies on a plane represented in 2D, it's not always obvious where that right point is. Enemies, of course, do not have this issue. They know where you are, and are computers, so you're at a disadvantage not of your making. And this is a problem that rarely or never comes up in, say, Golden Axe or Streets of Rage, so it's not something Care can't sort out. What paradoxically helps here is the enemy types are repetitive and limited, so you could probably figure it out for all the ones you're actually likely to meet. What doesn't help is that enemies have a thing most games only give the player. After you hit them, they're invincible for a time. It seems a small thing, but they can still hit you, and it pretty much ruins the concept of a beat 'em up, because you can only get one hit on an enemy, so all the fun of moves and combos goes right out, and you end up with a game of running around the screen like an idiot, avoiding enemies that are both invincible and lethal. This is especially egregious when you get multiple projectile firing enemies on the screen, where the legendary athletic abilities of the Avengers, you know, the thing the game is supposed to be based on, would rather have come in handy. There are some impressive touches, like the enemies with giant comic book hands, but the overriding feeling is this is the game Superplay thought the actually rather nice Death and Return of Superman was when they reviewed it a year later. Were they just biased against comic book beat-em-ups after this abomination or something? In any case, they somehow managed to give this a higher mark than that game, which... Look, go back to episode 2 and watch, they're actually mad. If you're a fan of beat-em-ups, don't bother with this. If you're a fan of comic books, don't bother with this. If you're a fan of the Avengers, then sadly still don't bother with this. It's got nothing to do with them really, and you should have nothing to do with it. A bumper Yesterzine this week, so the back page is a house ad for the 73% trials, the series where we took Amiga Power's suggestion that 73% was the lowest mark you could give a game without getting the PR people upset, and put the reviews that gave that mark on trial to see if they'd even bothered playing the thing, much less marking it fairly. Along the way, we have the One, Sega Power, Mean Machines, and even Amiga Power themselves in the dock. As Amiga Power said in their last issue, they too must now be judged. Meanwhile, this show continues, and a successful clicking of subscribe has a non-zero chance of putting it in your feed. Pro strat is to click the bell icon, which forces YouTube to realise you actually meant it. And we'll see you back here as Commodore's beloved bread bin takes centre stage. Goodbye.